Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's stay-at-home lecture for November. I'm Tim Nutt, Director of the Historical Research Center at UAMS, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's presentation. As I mentioned, I'm Tim Nutt, Director of the Historical Research Center, and that is the Archives Division of UAMS. We're located in the UAMS Library. We are charged with preserving the history of UAMS, so the institutional record of UAMS, but also the preservation of the health sciences throughout Arkansas. We are the only archives in the state that is dedicated to the preservation of the health sciences in Arkansas. And I would encourage you, if when the campus opens back up to visitors, I'd love to give you a tour of our facility. We're located in the Education 2 building on campus in the UAMS library. We have our contact information on the screen there. And tonight's presentation, and in fact the entire series, this entire stay-at-home lecture series, is sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions, which is the friends group of the UAMS Historical Research Center. The Society provides all sorts of support for the Historical Research Center in terms of purchasing books and materials for the archives, as well as helping us with programming such as this lecture series. I'd encourage you to join the Society. If you're not a member, the dues are inexpensive, $15 for an individual, $5 for a student. And you do not have to be just a student at UAMS. It could be any student at any university across the United States, and even high school students if someone is interested in that. I have the link for the Society's webpage on your screen right now. If you are interested in learning more about the Society or to join the Society, you could go to that URL that's on the screen, or you could bypass that and just go to paypal.me/shmhb, and that will take you directly to the PayPal account where you could just pay your dues online and skip all the URL and the information about the Society if you're just interested in joining. This is the stay-at-home lecture series. It's a monthly series. We do it every first Thursday. And so we have tonight's, and then we have one for the final year of 2021. We've been doing these since March of last year. I think this is our number 25th show presentation that we've done. In December, I will finish out the year, and I'm going to be talking about the history of the UAMS College of Pharmacy. And then we'll start again in January with a whole new round. I don't know exactly how long we'll be doing the virtual ones in next year. Hopefully we'll be able to get together in person at some point next year as hopefully the COVID pandemic winds down. Tonight, I am very pleased to welcome Janis Percefull from Hot Springs. She earned her BA in history from Ouachita Baptist University in Arkadelphia and her MA in public history from UALR. Until 2017, she was a history instructor at National Park College in Hot Springs, and she is also an author of a number of titles. Presently, she is working on Elderberry Summer, the third in a historical fiction series, for middle grade, for the middle grade. Tonight, she's going to be talking about the 1895 smallpox epidemic in Hot Springs. And so I am going to turn off my camera. I'm going to ask Janis to turn on her camera, and let's see if we can get that working. There you are, Janis, and you're unmuted yourself. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can share yours, and we'll get that going, and then I'll turn off my camera and audio.
I hate technology.
I hate technology too. So if you want to just hit your
the get going on this.
Yeah, and then I'll mute mine, and we'll get going.
Okay, I'm going, the first part of this presentation, I'm going to be stressing 2 points. One is that we are all products of our time, that what happens in our lives has a bearing on what or how we think and how we act and how we react. And the second point I want to stress is that no event happens in a vacuum, even in epidemic. So the first part of this, I'm going to describe what it was like for people in the last part of the 19th century. And then I'm going, the second part, we're going to take from the middle part of the country, Milwaukee, down to Hot Springs, tracing the epidemic. So let me move this over. There were 3 outbreaks of smallpox in the 1890s that garnered national attention: Chicago and Milwaukee, both major US cities, and the nation's health resort in Hot Springs, Arkansas. One of the big events that occurred during the period was the Chicago World's Fair. This event affected Chicago's response to the outbreak of the smallpox, and it was also an event that became a positive counter to many of the negative events in the 1890s, including the smallpox epidemic. Historically, 2 common factors that public health officials have to deal with, what they have to deal with is a battle between individual liberty and public welfare. And they also have to deal with societal tensions, which is usually caused by 2 groups of people who do not get along or who do not trust one another. Public health officials, or at least those who were trying to do their job in a professional manner, ended up having to deal with these 2 factors during the 1890s smallpox epidemic. In the 1890s, Hot Springs had its share of societal tensions, as they had a substantial immigrant population, and by tradition, they were a stronghold for organized labor activity. Also, the Hot Springs epidemic coincided with a national debate over vaccinations. And as if that wasn't enough, the epidemic arrived just in time for the 1895 election, with a hotly contested race for mayor. Most people, wherever they lived in the world, they were afraid of smallpox. It is a disease that dates back to antiquity. It spreads quickly. It's a horrible way to die, and if you live through it, you are terribly scarred. Any outbreak had the power to paralyze people with fear. At the time of the 1890s outbreak of smallpox, the world was going through one of the most fascinating times in human history. 2 revolutions were taking place: the harnessing and practical application of electricity and the development and general application of the germ theory. The germ theory not only stated what caused disease, but refuted the long-held belief in the miasmic theory. And the miasmic theory stated that rotting vegetation and carcasses would send up these poisonous gases and vapors, and they would be caught in the mist and the fog, and that's how disease was spread. So once the germ theory was developed, you can see why people didn't readily accept it, because for centuries they had been believing in the miasmic theory. The water cure started being practiced around 1820 in America on the East Coast, and was thriving in Hot Springs by the 1830s. It became a counter to heroic medicine. Now, heroic medicine was, you did bloodletting, that was part of it. And you also, the doctors they believed that if you purged your system of these diseases, so they would give you medicines that would cause you to throw up or have diarrhea. So you can understand that these procedures would actually weaken people. And the closer you got to the middle of the 19th century, the larger the doses got, hence the name heroic medicine. So when people came to hot springs, they would have to stop taking any medications. Diet became very important to build up their bodies. And the cold and warm springs were used, and drinking the water as well as bathing in it was part of the cure. By the late 1870s, people on all levels of the economic scale came to hot springs, believing the federal government offered national health care and that the government owned, endorsed, and controlled the hot springs and surrounding area. Wealthy people would pay to be entertained while confined to the spa for treatments, which a lot of times took weeks and even months. They would also transact business, and as their families often accompanied them, they found health resorts. And by the way, this is not just in hot springs, but the health spas also back in New York. There was a health water cure region, as well as in Virginia. But so the people who brought their families and they were well-to-do, they found that this was a suitable a place to find suitable marriage partners for their children. Others came to find their fortune. We also had a lot of indigents in the hot springs area, as well as many soldiers from both sides of the Civil War would come to hot springs as well, and filtered in here very soon in the aftermath of the Civil War. In 1878, the federal government took over the hot springs. There was a lot of court cases to settle, and they came in, they brought federal troops with them. And before, it wasn't too long after that there was a fire that burnt down the town. And it probably also helped get rid of a lot of diseases. Meanwhile, in that same year of 1878, the World's Fair in Paris was showcasing the practical application of electricity. And it was also most likely helping smallpox to spread, since the Franco-Persian War, fought in 1870-71, triggered a smallpox epidemic that lasted until 1875, and it killed 500,000 Europeans. And again in 1889, France hosted another World's Fair, and again this gathering of people from all over the world most likely helped keep smallpox thriving. In the years 1880 to the turn of the century, it was a dramatic time. You had epidemics, labor unrest, natural disasters, national depression, great wealth, and great poverty. It was a time of contradictions. It was the seeds of the Edwardian era. Now, the Edwardian era was noted for elegance and luxury for the wealthy class, lessening of morals. There was a lot of leisure time and endless garden parties and banquets. Women wore large hats and ridiculously shaped corsets. While their corsets were less restricting to internal organs in the abdomen and stomach, they caused numerous other health problems in women, especially back problems. Not everyone could afford fine clothing and safe housing. Thus, there was overcrowding, which helped to spread diseases like smallpox. It was also a time of wonder, a time of struggle, a time of opulence, and a time of grinding poverty. A time of great distractions like baseball, boxing, bicycles, and bloomers. So while France was planning its 1889 Paris Exposition, in Hot Springs, Arkansas, the Army-Navy Hospital was under construction and opened its door in January 1887. By the 1890s, Hot Springs was quickly becoming a modern city and was being continuously advertised as owned, endorsed, and conducted by the United States government. And don't forget that this was also the birth, this time period was the birth of advertising. So think newspapers and magazines, because the announcements about hot springs were in quite a few back then. Given human nature, societal tensions are never totally or permanently subdued. And of course, these societal tensions seem to always throw a monkey wrench into any fight against epidemics and natural or man-made disasters. The decade of the 1890s was filled with social tensions. Immigration, labor, gender, and racial issues abound. In the midst of all this turmoil and drama, preparations for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair was underway. It opened May 1st and closed October 30th of 1893. To give you some idea of the enormous undertaking, it covered 690 acres. The main buildings used nearly 20,000 tons of iron and steel, 70 million feet of lumber. And just to give you an idea of the labor, I've not seen any calculation of labor in terms of how many overall, when you consider how much lumber had to be harvested, how much steel had to be made. But if you, and also in the maintenance of this, because once it was built, it had to be maintained every day. Just the men who were engaged in cleaning the grounds every day, it was 15,000 men just to clean. It was just, it was huge. Every state in the Union was preparing to be represented at the World's Fair. Now remember, there were from other countries as well, but every state in the United States, well, except Arkansas. In 1891, the legislature in Arkansas voted to postpone funding of the state's representation at the Chicago World's Fair and never took up the issue again. The financial institutions in Arkansas were already shaky. They were on shaky grounds 3 months before the Panic of '93, as demonstrated by an article in the Arkansas Gazette in January of '93. So the prominent, fortunately, the prominent bankers in Little Rock were able to stop a run on the First National Bank. Ultimately, the women of Arkansas stepped in to make sure Arkansas was represented at the World's Fair. The move was led by the governor's wife, Mrs. Mary Ingle, and other prominent women. A sanctioned association charged with issuing exposition stock was formed in Arkansas with a board of directors and a women's auxiliary. The women not only raised the money, but they organized the exhibits. It was an extraordinary feat. The buildings, as you can see, were substantial. During the planning stages for the World's Fair, Florence Kelley, Jane Addams, and a number of other prominent women in Chicago publicly resigned from the fair planning committee in protest. Some historians contend that the protest was over a few unreported cases of smallpox. Bertha Palmer was appointed president of the Board of Lady Managers. The Conservative Women's Auxiliary was a group of wealthy and prominent Chicago women who were involved in the city's philanthropic organizations. And although Ms. Palmer was not officially a member of the Women's Auxiliary, her views were essentially identical as hers. Their goal for the exposition was to construct a women's pavilion to separate women's contributions. They got their wish over the objections of many women. Phoebe Cousins, she was the World's Fair, let's see, she was the secretary of the Lady Managers. She ended up clashing with Ms. Palmer and the rest of the Board of Ladies, and ended up being removed from her position. She was also she was the first female lawyer in the United States and the first female appointed as a U.S. Marshal, and she was a well-known suffragist. Besides having buildings representing every state in the United States, there were buildings from countries all over the world and also many official buildings. It would take several minutes to run through all the slides needed to show the many, many buildings. Again, I say it was a huge undertaking. Ida Wells went to Chicago in 1893 to protest the exclusion of African Americans from exhibits at the World's Columbian Exposition, but no meaningful concession was forthcoming. Although there were there were African Americans that did find work in the service sector. Also, Ms. Wells eventually moved to Chicago permanently, involving herself in a wide range of civic and club activities, which included her continuing fight against lynching. A temporary organization within the women's group of the World's Fair, called the World's Congress of Representative Women, collected over 2 million signatures on a petition to promote women's rights. A concession was made to build a woman's building housing a library with 7,000 books, all written by women, and there were artistic displays. Also, 500 women from around the world were allowed to give speeches in the women's building. However, while women did play a role in the World's Fair in Chicago, they did so as an auxiliary to men, which was very reflective of the society at the time. 9 days after the World Fair opened, a stock market panic was triggered by the collapse of a couple of really big businesses, and this caused a cascading disaster within the financial industry. The World's Fair continued unabated, and by the end of summer, a smallpox epidemic was taking foot in the Windy City. Everyone called this a rich man's panic, giant capitalists gobbling up smaller capitalists. This rich man's panic lasted from May to November of '93. However, the cascading effect that took place created the Great Depression, and that lasted until 1897. Now, the Great Depression lost its name in 1930 when the second Great Depression took hold. The electrical lighting was a special source of wonder and excitement as people saw its possibilities for their own lives, and it was part of a continuing counter to the worrisome depression that was setting in. Also, the bicycle manufacturers were well represented, which added to a craze for the wheel that would last a decade and ultimately placed the bicycle at the center of an international medical controversy and the fight for women's rights. In the end, the Chicago World's Fair set a standard against which every subsequent fair was measured. 27 to 28 million people attended. Millions more experienced it through postcards or accounts in newspapers and magazines. Most Americans regarded the fair as a cultural touchstone and remembered it for the rest of their life. However, by early autumn, a smallpox epidemic was spreading throughout the city. Then just before the closing ceremonies, the Chicago mayor was assassinated. When the fair closed, some of Chicago's unemployed took refuge in abandoned buildings on the World's Fair grounds. A short time later, a fire swept through the fairgrounds, destroying many of the buildings. During the winter, which was one of the coldest in Chicago's history, the fire that swept through the fairgrounds and destroyed many of the buildings, there were over 100,000 unemployed men who had taken refuge in the buildings. It's important to remember that by the 1890s, Chicago had long been an important transportation hub with its close proximity to some of the most productive farmland in the world. Plus, waterways and railroads allowed agricultural products in the region to be shipped across the country and around the world. By the end of the 19th century, this region's grain market became the world's preeminent commodity market. This was due in part by the fact that Europe was had experienced terrible crop losses due to a prolonged drought in 1889 and again in 1890, with a total collapse of its grain production in 1891. When the farmers in the Midwest here in the United States, they went into debt in order to expand the number of acres they had under cultivation. So the last thing the Midwest region needed was a full-blown smallpox epidemic. As the smallpox epidemic was growing in Chicago, another outbreak occurred in August of '93 in Muncie, Indiana. There was a resistance on the part of city officials to address the problem. It took several weeks to enact measures to prevent the spread, and then resistance to measures when they were enacted. Also, people were slow to accept that the problem was smallpox, and people refused to be vaccinated and believed the health officials had overreacted. Also, one local newspaper concurred, which made matters even worse. Then in May of 1894, Mrs. Florence Kelly, she's now the chief of the State Board of Factory Inspectors, reported to the Chicago Health Commissioner several confirmed cases of smallpox within the tenements and sweatshops, which brought a lot of concern to federal health officials because of overcrowding in these places. When the smallpox epidemic moved into Milwaukee in December of '94, the situation got real ugly, real fast, and it lasted for months. Panic, distrust in the immigrant, which was German and Polish community, poor decisions made by city officials that seemed to favor the wealthier neighborhoods, entrenched political establishment, and rumors, some that may have had validity, conspired to ignite a very volatile situation. Papers across the country chronicled smallpox outbreaks and epidemics all across the United States, including the ones in Chicago and Milwaukee. It is reasonable to conclude that visitors and residents in Hot Springs followed the latest news concerning outbreaks, especially in the middle region. When it hit, a few days later, let's see. On the 12th of January of 1895, when the story broke that jockeys and stablemen at Robbie, Indiana, and that was real close to Chicago, just a few blocks from Chicago, just over the border. The news report was that they were scrambling to find a healthier environment. So authorities in Hot Springs should have been on guard, since the town had a racing season from the 22nd of January to the end of March. A few days later, smallpox hit St. Louis. This was on the 28th of January. There were also outbreaks in 3 counties in Missouri, one up in the Northwest and 2 down in the Southeast. The more people do local history, the more we're probably going to find out there were a lot more outbreaks than what has been noted here. In February was the busy season for visitors in Hot Springs, but much happened to keep people away and destroy the town's economy. First, a late winter blizzard kept visitors away. then a series of disastrous fires that many suspected were set on purpose. The final one on February the 22nd destroyed a large residential and business portion of the town, including several rental properties owned by Mayor R.L. Williams. City health official Dr. Berry, behind the scenes doing what he was supposed to be doing, he issued a bulletin on Sunday, February 24th, stating that there was only one case of smallpox. But even as he was getting ready to issue his bulletin on Sunday morning, authorities in the nearby town of Malvern issued a quarantine against Hot Springs. Also, a correspondent with the Arkansas Gazette, a state paper, reported on Monday, February the 25th, that there were at least 25 cases of smallpox in Hot Springs. One confirmed and 4 suspected cases in Malvern, and that another nearby town, Arkadelphia, had issued a quarantine against both Hot Springs and Malvern. Visitors in Hot Springs remained blissfully unaware of reports from Malvern until Tuesday, February 26th, when rumors circulated that at the time Dr. Berry was preparing his bulletin, there were 75 cases being treated. These rumors sent hundreds of visitors dashing to the through train to St. Louis, the only train allowed to breach the Malvern quarantine, which I thought was kind of crazy that they would allow any train out. When they arrived in St. Louis, its papers did not waste time printing their story, sending it out across the country. And that's when everyone started blaming Hot Springs for the spread of smallpox. Since a fair portion of the passengers were likely from the St. Louis area, there's reason to believe they may have been more susceptible to panic over an outbreak of smallpox, as the disease was in the St. Louis area the month before. In an attempt to stem the tide of rumors in Hot Springs, Dr. Berry issued a bulletin on the evening of Thursday, February 28th, only hours after the St. Louis passenger report broke. As his report was in out-of-state papers the next morning, it's likely that he sent out his bulletin by telegraph. 3 of the papers that carried his bulletin were in Nebraska, Utah, and California. From this official communication, it is evident that Dr. Berry took what actions he could to suppress the smallpox outbreak, including issuing a threat against physicians who failed to report cases of smallpox. Therefore, while out-of-state newspapers continued to report the smallpox epidemic in Hot Springs, the City Council, in their regularly scheduled meeting Friday, March 1st, mainly took up matters concerning license refunds on account of the fires. The exception was Ms. Fitzsimmons. She was the proprietor of the Alhambra Hotel on Ouachita Avenue. She petitioned the council for $10.40 worth of bedding destroyed by the city on account of the smallpox. This may be the one case that Dr. Berry reported in his bulletin February 24th. Despite all the panic and lack of cooperation in some quarters, it appears that the physicians involved in suppressing the epidemic acquitted themselves well. In the wake of the blizzard, fires, and epidemic, a monumental economic hardship set in, affecting everyone in Hot Springs. The African American community was concerned that there was no longer an African American on the police force. Unions protested the use of scab labor in construction and demanded that the city council prohibit employment of aliens, which was anyone not a resident of the city, this was on city work projects. After the epidemic played itself out, Hot Springs, in customary manner, stood up, dusted itself off, and continued on as the nation's health resort. The end.
Thank you so much, Janice. If you will stop the share, and I am going to do that. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was very interesting. I was not familiar with the smallpox epidemic of 1895 before you and I started talking about doing this presentation.
Right.
So is this one not well known in the historical community or in the public health history?
I'm really not, I'm not sure. I wrote this about 10 years ago, so it probably is now.
Well, yeah, of course it is now.
I don't know. Hot Springs has had so many disasters. The fires themselves were probably chronicled, but I actually don't know. Now, Liz Robbins could tell you right off the bat.
She could. Liz can just.
Yeah, she's hip to this.
Yeah. If anyone has any questions, please use the chat feature and ask your questions. Go ahead.
And Timothy, first of all, I apologize. I felt like I just ran through that.
No, you're fine. I think you're right on schedule, so that's perfectly fine. At least we have plenty of time for questions. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them. Did the smallpox, you mentioned Malvern doing a quarantine or right before
they did a quarantine.
Quarantine. Did that happen anywhere else in Arkansas during the smallpox, the one in Hot Springs? Did other cities in Arkansas do that as well?
I never saw anything outside of Arkadelphia did a quarantine against Malvern and Hot Springs. If I had done more research, I might have found it, but I was honing in just on the Hot Springs area. So, and with that through train through Malvern, that was an important thing there. Yeah. But it really surprised me they would allow people out knowing there was small. I mean, it was great. One thing I didn't bring up because I was whizzing through the whole thing. On the 28th of January, when it hit St. Louis, I saw this little notice in the paper, in the St. Louis paper, that they were doing a secret serum there, which I tried to track that down. That's the only mention of it. So I noticed there was somebody had a question.
Yeah, someone, Jim has a question. How many or what proportion of the population was vaccinated against the infection? Do we know?
Well, I made the assumption they all were. It was an impression I got. I couldn't give you the numbers, but my impression was that they got down on it. You see in the city council where they write down that they got their lances, their little points from Harold's Pharmacy, and there were several doctors involved in this. And if memory serves me right, they just literally went door to door. Seems like also that they burned a lot of things, bedding and this and that. And this, of course, the town had its share of fires anyway. So you kind of have to wonder, well, did that kind of help the situation not get out of hand with the smallpox? I don't know.
You may have mentioned this, but if so, I missed it. What was the population of Hot Springs? About the population?
Ooh, I don't know. Lordy mercy. I have no idea. I'd have to look that up.
Yeah, we'll have to look that up because I'm curious. And then, of course, with the racing season going on, that would have brought probably hundreds, if not thousands of people into the city.
This was a time when you had a lot of what they call floating population. But it was really dire what happened that year, the whole thing, the blizzards, the fires, the epidemic. And what ultimately happened was the town was the leaders of the town were trying to figure out what can we do to survive this coming year, because you really had to make it. That for a lot of businesses, that was the time to make it. And one of the things I've done with my middle grade series is that I've used the actual events that took place. So where we are now is in Cedar Glades, and they had left town because there was nothing going to be happening in town. And even when the smallpox subsided, so they left, and I made it up that's what they found. But the real event for book number 4, the real event that took place in Hot Springs was a boxing match that was supposed to be the boxing match of the century, and it didn't take place. But the story is what happened that it didn't take place, and it's just a hoot. I'm not into boxing, but when as with so many things in the 1890s, this was a transitional period between the bare-fisted boxing going into the Queensberry rules and this and that. But it was a fight between Gentleman Jim Corbett, and I had to study up on all this because I didn't know any of this. I did know about Gentleman Jim Corbett because he was also a matinee star before there was a matinee. I mean, he was like the first, and I'm going, wait a minute, the guy was a boxer. No. So, but I love this idea of going at the actual real events and the marriage of the characters, the make-believe characters and all that. But they're believable characters for the time, you know. So I'm having fun with that.
Well, good. And I will say that I love your series, even if it's written for, even if it's written for the middle grade. I've read it, and the books that you have written.
Well, let me tell you how I started this, since we're waiting on someone to ask a question. When I was going around the state with the book that I did based on my master's thesis, I had people, well, there were a lot of kids that would come up and ask me that, oh, you from Hot Springs? And they'd ask me questions. And so the people who worked at these stores, they said, why don't you do a fiction? And I was going, geez, you know, I mean, it takes a lot to go to get your degree and all that. And I will continue that story after we answer this man's question.
Well, it's actually the population, 1890 population of Hot Springs was a little over 8,000.
I would have said 12. I missed it. Yeah.
And then in 1900, about 10,000, 9973. So,
okay, good to know. Good to know.
I have a question about so the epidemic, the public health response to this was obviously done by local officials, Hot Springs officials. Right. Do you know, did they get any help from the public health clinic that was in Hot Springs, Wingers? I know that was for venereal diseases, but was that at all involved in that?
Yeah, Winger came later.
Right, yeah.
I was trying to think, they did have the government-free bathhouse.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. There was actually no mention of it in the city records. And I actually didn't look to see if the federal boys did anything.
Well, of course, we didn't have a state board of health at that time. The state board of health wasn't established until 1913.
Right.
And so, and I know in my research for the 1918 flu, the United States Public Health Services, the officials are the ones that took control of the response to the 1918 flu. So,
right.
You know, I'm wondering if maybe this epidemic was so small that maybe it didn't warrant the federal government coming in and handling it. Maybe the local officials could handle it.
Yeah, the real story of this epidemic was how it was blown up. Mm-hmm. And like the letters that Sarah Ellsworth letters that she had written to her son, you can tell she doesn't think this is much of an epidemic. And she's real upset that it's all being blown up because it's keeping people from coming, and that's their livelihood. Mm-hmm. and it's killing them. She said they're, in one letter, we're all scratching around for some, it was this, the story is, and bringing this into today, because I see so many parallels. And of course, people are people no matter when they live, and you are a product of your times. You do act and react. And so we're going into a very similar pattern where economics is what's going to kill us if we don't get a hold of this. And we just, I'm preaching to the choir, I know, but I mean, health is important. I mean, public health. We all breathe the same air. And so.
It is interesting. And you touched on this a couple of times. Hot Springs has really had a tough time in its history with fires and disease and
floods.
Yeah. It's amazing that it still survives and it prospered.
And it's due to the water. Mm-hmm. We have a treasure here that, oh my goodness, people all over the world. I talk to people. I get water downtown, and about every 2 weeks or so. And I make a point of talking to, I have a little dog, we go walking in the park, and I make a point of talking to people, and they find out I'm from Hot Springs. And, oh man, they ask me questions, which I love. And you see it reflected in them, the importance of this water, mm-hmm. and the importance of safeguarding it. It's that's with all water. I'm on a real tear lately not lately, for years now, of protecting our water, not just here in Hot Springs, but all of Arkansas. We need to protect our water. It's getting, there's so much pollution in so many parts of the world. So I don't
I read this has been a few years ago, but someone mentioned in an article that the wars of the future will be fought over water.
Oh yes, they have in the past too. It's actually not a new thing. I mean, right. It's kind of a basic for, yeah.
If we still have a few minutes for questions, if anyone has anything while we're waiting, if someone is interested in purchasing your books, where would they go to purchase them?
Well, they have them at the Garland County Historical Society would be the easiest place for them to pick them up. I'm actually in the process of trying to get an agent so I can go to a bigger publishing house. Mr. Archibald, my publisher, is a regional, but the way the publishing houses or the whole industry is structured now, it's like seed companies. You got the 5 big seed companies, well, you got the 5 big publishers, and they've bought up all the imprints. So even if your imprint is under one of these, it's really so you have to go through an agent now. And Mr. Archibald's been after me for some time to go to a bigger house, because then I can go national. And so many teachers want my books in their classrooms, but it's not going to happen unless I go to a bigger publishing house. So,
I think that would be great if you got a bigger audience for your books, because I just think they're wonderful.
Yeah, and the one I'm doing now, of course, what you're working on is always the one you get excited about. I'm really excited about this one. I think I had a lapse between the first 2 and this one because life interrupted life, that sort of thing. And it's really good. It's a good story. But I was going to say a while ago when I was traveling around, what finally decided me to go historical fiction after I'd worked so hard to have a reputation, good reputation, was who better than a historian to write the history right? And so the first one I did strictly as a lark to see if I could do it. And then everybody that read it kept saying, well, when's the next one coming out? When I said, next one. So then I did the next one. And I'll tell you something. If you ever have a question about should you write or not write? Write. Because the greatest pleasure I've gotten is feedback from people. And some of the things they have told me, I had and by the way, I wrote it for all ages. It was 5th grade level, but that's for all ages.
Mhm.
But I
don't feel so bad about reading.
No, because I wrote it. And then this whole thing about middle grade, and the teachers wanted it. And I said, hey, let's call it middle grade. But this man who was a math teacher, he had already read Three Strangers. And then he came to one of my book signings. And he said when he got to the part about the wheelchair man, he started crying. Well, I was right in the middle of a book signing. I got up and I said, Mister, you couldn't have told me anything better than that. I had another woman, one more story, because this story, a woman read one of my books, the first Three Strangers, and she was waiting on the second one to come out. And I saw her one day and she said, I've read 2 books in my life. And of course, the woman was, grown and everything. And she saw the puzzle look. She goes, well, all the way through. And I said, okay. And she said, one of them was yours.
Well, that's high praise.
Yeah. And I said, what was the other one? She said, it was a biography of Amelia Earhart. So on the way home, I called my aunt and I was just about to cry. And I said, clearly, if I died today, I would die happy. And I really felt that way. So to me, the rest of it's cream, no matter what else happens. But I really want these books in the schools. So.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, good luck with everything, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
I learned so much, and I'm so thankful for the research that you've done on this epidemic, whether they think it's an actual epidemic or not. I'm happy that you did.
Well, it was. Yeah. So,
well, thank you so much. I want to touch on answer someone's comment to me earlier, a private message, and I did mention. I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but all of these are recorded. All of these presentations are recorded and they're uploaded to the Society's YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube and look for Society for the History of Medicine, this one will be up there probably in the next week or so. But when we do go live, we will still be recording these, and they will be available for people to watch if you're unable to make the in-person one. Like I said, I don't know how long we'll continue the virtual. It just depends on the pandemic. But of course, it could be live and it could be virtual for someone else because they could just be watching the live on their computer. So virtual is just a word, I guess, that doesn't really mean anything nowadays. So, well, thank you so much. Thank you all, everyone, for being here. Stay safe. We'll see you on December 2nd for the last stay-at-home lecture for 2021. Keep sending those suggestions. We did get one suggestion about a history of occupational therapy in Arkansas, and I will look into that. And we'll look forward to seeing you in December. Y'all stay safe and y'all have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.